Hello, and welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. For those of us who are familiar with Northern Virginia, there are many landmarks that we're very much used to seeing all the time around us. If you're driving on 395, the Pentagon is one of the most visible buildings you're going to find. If you're driving down Route 1 and stuck in the never-ending traffic, more often than not, we can blame it on Fort Belvoir. If you go further south along I-95, sometimes you find that traffic there can be rather thick because of the Quantico Marine Base. And so when we look at all these different military structures, we wonder, they create such an annoying impact to us today, but what kind of impact did they have on us some time ago? And so it's on this wonder of impact that we think about the past. And so two of Northern Virginia's largest and most enduring military facilities, those of Fort Belvoir and the Quantico Marine Corps Base, were born as a result of America's entry into the First World War. By the late 19th century, Belvoir, the stately estate of George William Fairfax, who was an old and dear friend of George Washington and husband of Washington's purported secret love, Sally Fairfax, lay in ruins. One visitor to the site, just south of Mount Vernon, on bluffs above the Potomac River, wrote, quote, "All was a tangle of brushwood and fallen trees, but such an enchanting view over the river. There were some heaps of brick and a poor old fig tree in the clearing, which I suppose was once the garden." The federal government acquired the Belvoir Peninsula in 1910 with plans to develop the area into a reformatory. Local citizens band together with patriotic organizations such as the Daughters of the American Revolution and the Mount Vernon Ladies Association in opposing the establishment of a reformatory so close to Mount Vernon. The reformatory idea was scrapped, and Congress transferred the property to the War Department in 1912, following a request by the U.S. Army's Engineer School to use the area as a training site. Now, the Army's Engineer School, located in Washington, needed field training areas and rifle ranges. The Belvoir Peninsula provided challenging terrain where soldiers could build pontoon bridges and conduct rifle practice. Now, when America entered World War I in April 1917, it became clear that you would need more military bases in the nation. And so in January of 1918, Camp AAA Humphreys, named after the Union Civil War general and former Chief of Engineer Corps Andrew A. Humphreys, was established on the Belvoir Peninsula. Within only 4 months of the start of construction, Camp AAA Humphreys was in operation. Over the course of 11 months, extensive camp facilities were constructed, with most of the heavy labor being done by segregated African-American service battalions. To accommodate the 20,000 troops who were to use the camp, 790 temporary wood frames buildings were constructed. A newly constructed dam across Accotink Creek and a water filtration plant assured a steady flow of fresh water. Transportation systems and utilities were also improved. The unpaved Washington-Richmond Highway was surfaced in concrete within 6 months, and a plank road was built linking the camp to the highway. Standard gauge and narrow gauge railways followed. Building these transportation systems facilitated deliveries to the camp and provided engineer training experience for troops being sent to Europe. During 1918, some 60,000 troops received training in engineering, trench warfare, and gas warfare. After the war, Camp AAA Humphreys became a permanent installation and was renamed Fort Belvoir in the 1930s. Down the river in Prince William County, another major military installation was taking shape. Told to expand its training capabilities, the Marine Corps began inspecting promising sites in the spring of 1917. Some 5,000 acres along Quantico Creek were leased from an ailing development company, which had been promoting the area for recreation. The area was largely uninhabited. There was an officially incorporated town, a shipyard, and a small hotel that had been built to attract tourists. The first Marine contingent to arrive consisted of 91 enlisted men and 4 officers. Soon thousands would come pouring in for training. There were not enough barracks, and the troops did their laundry in the river. Troops unaccustomed to a Virginia summer complained, quote, "Quantico was hotter than a pistol and muddier than a pigsty." Aviation first arrived at Quantico in July 1918, when 2 kite balloons were flown to spot artillery fire. Soon 4 seaplanes were assigned to Quantico. Naval aviation actually began in 1911, only 6 years after the Wright brothers' first successful flight, with a congressional appropriation of $25,000. This money went for the purchase of 3 aircraft, one from the Wright brothers themselves. The first Marine aviator, he was the 5th Naval aviator, was First Lieutenant Alfred A. Cunningham. On December 7, 1917, the Marine aviators were ordered overseas to fight in France and to take part in anti-submarine warfare. In 1919, a flying field was laid out at Quantico and land leased to accommodate a squadron returning from combat in Europe. The facility was later named Brown Field in memory of 2nd Lieutenant Walter V. Brown, who lost his life in an early accident at that location. By 1920, Quantico Marine Corps Base had become a permanent fixture in Northern Virginia, as Marine Corps schools were founded and the Corps embarked on the mission to, quote, make this post and the whole Marine Corps a great university. And on a personal note, even growing up nearby the Marine Corps Base, it's still a very impressive sight to behold, considering how much land actually is held by the Marines even to this date. But while we think of Quantico as a Marine base, we have to admit that there is a standard fixture in the Northern Virginia area that certainly does seem to catch the eye, and that is the Pentagon. But few would ever realize that there was once a predecessor. And seeing the massive Pentagon today, few people realize that its predecessor was once referred to as Fort Runyon. This was built in the early days of the Civil War as part of the Union Army's defense of Washington, and was approximately the same size, shape, and in almost the same location as the modern-day Pentagon, built some 80 years later. The fort was constructed of timber and earthworks and guarded the approaches to the Long Bridge leading into Washington. Because of the importance of the Long Bridge, which linked Virginia directly with downtown Washington, Fort Runyon was designed to be the largest fort in the entire system of defenses protecting Washington. The perimeter, which is some 1,500 yards, was guarded by 21 guns and garrisoned by 2,000 troops. The fort was built directly at the crossroads of the 2 turnpikes and served as a checkpoint for vehicles entering the city via the Long Bridge. After the war, the fort was abandoned and taken over by squatters, most of whom were freed ex-slaves. The wood and timber that made up the fort was burned by squatters or scavenged for building materials in the first few years after the war. But the fort's embankments and trenches lasted much longer. A 1901 tour guide of Washington instructed tourists to look out of the windows of their train at the south end of the Long Bridge to catch a glimpse of the decaying fort, and saying, quote, erected in 1861 to guard the head of the bridge from raiders. 2 years later, a new railroad bridge was constructed, replacing the old Long Bridge. In 1906, a highway bridge was constructed nearby. Together, these 2 projects destroyed what little remained of Fort Runyon. The approach routes to the bridges ran directly through the fort's earthworks. By the 1930s, all traces of Fort Runyon had vanished. Today, though, if you're in search of it, Exit 9 on Interstate 95 is now at the approximate center of the old fort. And as the last traces of Fort Runyon vanished, the military was set to build a new pentagonal installation in Northern Virginia. In the 1930s, the War Department was scattered throughout dozens of buildings in Virginia, Maryland, and the District. In May of 1941, the Secretary of War told the President that the department needed a central location. Congress authorized a new headquarters for the War Department, and plans were drawn up. Arlington Farms, which was between Arlington National Cemetery and the Memorial Bridge, was selected as the site. The building was designed to conform to the dimensions and terrain of the site. In short, it was designed to be a pentagon to fit the space. When presented with the plan, President Roosevelt liked the design, but hated the site, which would have impaired the view of Washington from Arlington National Cemetery. Consequently, the design remained, but a new site was found. Ground was broken on September 11, 1941, less than 2 months prior to America's entry into World War II. The building was officially dedicated and ready for occupancy on January 15, 1943. Design and construction of such a building would normally have taken 4 years. Minimizing the use of steel because of the needs of World War II, the Pentagon was actually built as a reinforced concrete structure using 680,000 tons of sand dredged from the Potomac River. Army engineers avoided using critical war materials whenever possible. They substituted concrete ramps and stairways for passenger elevators and used concrete drain pipes rather than metal pipes. They eliminated bronze doors, copper ornaments, and metal toilet partitions, and avoided any unnecessary ornamentation. The Pentagon is the world's largest office building by floor area, housing some 26,000 military and civilian employees. The building has 5 sides, 5 floors above ground, and 5 ring corridors per floor, with a total of 17.5 miles of corridors. It covers 26 acres. And exactly 60 years after the groundbreaking ceremony, the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks occurred. Hijacked American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the west side of the Pentagon, killing almost 200 people both on board the plane and inside the building. The plane penetrated 3 of the Pentagon's 5 rings. The task of rebuilding the damaged section of the Pentagon was given the name the Phoenix Project, and set a goal of having the outermost offices of the damaged section occupied again by September 11, 2002. The first Pentagon tenants whose offices had been damaged during the attack began moving back in on August 15, 2002, nearly a month ahead of schedule. And so, if you go visit the Pentagon and drive by, a lot of people oftentimes want to see that particular section of the wall. It is possible to see it off of 395. And if you do pay attention to where the Air Force Memorial is, it is almost within a straight line shot of the actual location of where the attack had been hit. And as one who did see that particular site after September 11th, it is a location that one does seem to remember no matter how often you pass the building. And oftentimes your eyes do tend to drift back to that one section of the Pentagon. But while many of us oftentimes think of World War I and World War II being of the past, an event that we can never forget about is the Cold War. And with the end of World War II, America entered into the prolonged task of containing international communism, which is oftentimes referred to, of course, as the Cold War. With Pearl Harbor still fresh in America's memory, the threat of a surprise attack by foreign enemies was considered not only possible, but more likely. On January 12, 1951, President Harry S. Truman signed the Civil Defense Bill, designed to protect Americans in the event of nuclear war. The Civilian Defense Administration encouraged families living within a 10-mile radius of the city of Washington to prepare bomb shelters. The government distributed booklets which showed people how to prepare shelters from sandbags in the basement to elaborate underground shelters that included ventilation. All shelters would be stocked with food, medicine, and supplies to last a family for at least 7 days. Now, those who could not afford shelters were encouraged to stock their basements with food and water and seal the basement windows against radiation. School children were routinely drilled in air raid procedures. At the sound of the air raid siren, children were instructed to duck and cover under their desks, with the noses touching their knees. Television and radio programs were routinely interrupted for tests of the emergency broadcast system. However, before it was referred to as the Conelrad from 1951 to 1963. The Northern Virginia Regional Defense Council released evacuation plans that designated routes to move 650,000 residents out of the blast zone. In 1954, the Army announced the construction of 16 Nike missile sites encircling the Washington-Baltimore area. 3 of these sites were located in Northern Virginia near Fairfax Station, Lorton, and Great Falls. Nike missiles were designed to shoot down long-range Soviet bombers and gave local residents some feeling of safety, at least until the late 1960s, when the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, better referred to as ICBMs, made the Nike missile obsolete. All the Nike sites in the area were closed by 1974. The Cold War reached a fevered pitch in 1962, when the Soviet Union introduced long-range nuclear missiles into Cuba. On Monday evening, October 22, 1962, at 7 p.m., President John F. Kennedy addressed the nation in a televised 17-minute speech, stating, quote, "Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites are now in preparation on the imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere." Now, interestingly enough, in looking at the strike potential, it was discovered that the southeastern portion of the United States came under heavy fire, including the Washington, D.C. region and a few miles north of it. Continuing the arc over, it would reach all the way out into a good portion of Texas. Anything south of that line could have potentially been prime targets for a nuclear attack. The president would impose a naval blockade on Cuba, and for 6 long days the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war as Soviet freighters carrying the offensive missiles approached the blockade. On October 28th, the president announced that Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had agreed to dismantle the bases and remove the missiles already in Cuba. The immediate crisis was over, but tensions remained high for decades to come. Advancing technology made conventional defense obsolete. The only deterrence remaining was the fear of mutual assured destruction, sometimes referred to as MAD. In 1979, the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment released a report entitled "The Effects of Nuclear War," which outlined what residents of Northern Virginia could expect in the event of war. If 1 megaton hydrogen bomb was detonated, which is 80 times more powerful than an atomic weapon used against Japan, on the Earth's surface, the following results could be expected. First, if you were within 1.7 miles of the blast, 98% of the population would be killed. Absolutely nothing would be recognizable that still stands within half a mile of the blast crater, which is 200 feet deep and at least 1,000 feet in diameter. Secondly, if you were within 2.7 miles of the blast, 50% of the population would have been killed outright. Homes are now reduced to their foundations, and larger buildings leave behind just skeletal remains. Third, if you are within 4.7 miles of the blast, 5% of the population has now been killed, and most of the buildings have been destroyed or rather severely damaged. Compounding the nightmare scenario was the strategy of both sides at the time to hit targets with more than just one means: ICBM and submarine-launched missiles, and with multiple missiles to ensure that the targets were completely destroyed. The attitude of one person who lived through the Cold War in Northern Virginia pretty well sums up the fears of the times. Quote, "When I was growing up in Annandale in the 60s, listening to the air raid siren down the street each week and the emergency broadcast systems on the radio, I assumed that the world would be blown up before I was 40, but that I wouldn't have anything at all to worry about personally, as I'd have been incinerated very early on." In fact, one thing that most people do remember about the 1980s in the Cold War is the film The Day After, in looking at what a nuclear holocaust would look like for the United States of America. The amount of blasts that had occurred certainly showed the devastation that could happen within this nation. It was actor John Lithgow whose character, as professor in Kansas, went ahead and estimated that depending on who fired their missiles first, one way or another, even if the United States was second, there would only be about a total of 18 minutes before the hit would have actually occurred. And as such, that was only a short amount of time in order to ensure that you could get into a safe shelter and try to ensure that you yourself could be protected. Another aspect of the Cold War was espionage. Not surprisingly, the Washington area was a hotbed of spy versus spy activity. Two of the most notorious traitors emerging from the Cold War era were native-born Americans living in Northern Virginia. Aldrich Ames, a CIA employee, became the best-paid traitor in American history by selling secrets to the Soviets for some $5 million in the late 1980s. This information resulted in the deaths of 10 counterintelligence agents working for the United States. Colleagues became suspicious when Ames began living a lavish lifestyle far beyond his apparent means, at one point paying cash for an expensive home in Arlington. Ames was arrested in 1994 and is currently serving a life sentence without parole. Even more notorious, however, was Robert Philip Hansen, an FBI agent who spied for the Soviet and Russian intelligence services against the United States for over 22 years. Hansen's activities have been characterized as, quote, possibly the worst intelligence disaster in U.S. history. Hansen was arrested February 18, 2001 at Foxstone Park, a favorite secret drop-off point for the spy, near his home in Vienna, Virginia. Hansen is currently serving a life sentence, also without parole. But what made Hansen so unique, though, was that he did not do what Ames had done. Instead of living a lavish lifestyle, the only amount of money he ever took from the Soviets was something that would be seen as well within his own means. He was able to send his children off to private school and basically led a very obscure life being a spy, showing that sometimes, if you do it right, spies can be amongst you without you ever realizing it. Finally, there's Arlington House. Now, when Union troops moved into Virginia in May of 1861, they immediately began taking up positions around Arlington House. 2 forts were built on the estate, including Fort Whipple, which is now referred to as Fort Myer, and Fort McPherson. The property was confiscated by the federal government when property taxes were not paid in person by Mrs. Lee. This would be a little difficult considering that her husband was now part of the Confederate military. Now, the property was offered for public sale on January 11, 1864, and was purchased by a tax commissioner for, quote, government use for war, military, charitable, and educational purposes. More than 1,100 freed slaves were given land around the house, where they farmed and lived during and after the Civil War. At this point, Brigadier General Montgomery C. Meigs, commander of the garrison in Arlington House and Quartermaster General of the Union Army, enters the picture. Meigs and Lee had served together many years earlier as military engineers in the Mississippi River. Lee was a first lieutenant and Meigs a subordinate, a second lieutenant. Did Meigs bear Lee a personal grudge? Some historians think so, or perhaps he was just embittered by the war itself, or by Lee's defection from the Union Army. In any event, tasked with finding additional burial grounds for battle casualties, on June 15, 1864, Meigs wrote to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton that, quote, the grounds about the mansion are admirably suited to such a use. Meigs himself reported his grim satisfaction of ordering 26 Union dead to be buried near Mrs. Lee's Rose Garden in June of 1864. Meigs had graves dug right up to the entrance to the house. The entire Rose Garden was dug up, and the remains of some 1,800 soldiers recovered from the Manassas battlefields buried there in a huge burial vault. Such an unusual positioning of graves was malicious. Meigs' intention appeared to be to prevent the Lee family from ever again inhabiting the house. By the time the Civil War ended, more than 16,000 Union soldiers were buried on the grounds of the estate. Ironically, Meigs' own son was killed in October of 1864 and sent to Arlington Cemetery for burial. Neither Robert E. Lee nor his wife ever stood foot in Arlington House again. General Lee died in 1870, and Mary Custis Lee visited the grounds shortly before her death in 1873, but was overcome by emotion and unable to go inside the house. After the death of his parents, George Washington Custis Lee claimed that the house and land had been illegally confiscated, and that, according to his grandfather's will, he was the legal owner. In December of 1882, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, returned the property to Lee, saying that it had been confiscated without due process. Would the debt have to be transferred to a new site? Lee diffused the crisis by selling the house and land to the government for a fair market value. In 1920, Alexander County was renamed Arlington County in honor of Robert E. Lee, and to end the ongoing confusion between both the city and the county. Arlington House itself was subsequently dedicated to the memory of Robert E. Lee. And we may never know what motivated Meigs, but history may have misjudged him. In 1884, Armistead Long was compiling information for a book on the life of Lee, and Meigs contributed his remembrance of Lee that he knew from a youth, of being a man then in the vigor of youthful strength, with a noble, commanding presence and an admirable grace and athletic figure, one with whom nobody ever wished or ventured to take a liberty, though he was kind and generous to his subordinates, admired by all women and men. He was respected as a model soldier and a beau of ideal Christian man today. Today, the house can still be seen as the final resting place for more than 250,000 American heroes. I hope you've enjoyed these stories from our new book, The Hidden History of Northern Virginia. To learn more about the hidden history, please visit our website, timetravel21.com. And this show has been made possible by a gift from the Margarita and Donald J. Metzger Endowment. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you once again here on Virginia Time Travel.